The Young and the Restless spoilers next week, June 30th to July 4th. When the storm finally relented and the skies above the French countryside cleared, the guests at Kane's estate were left with more than just the memory of wind and rain. The turbulence of nature had mirrored the turbulence of their circumstances, emotionally, psychologically, and strategically. Victor Newman, Nikki Newman, Billy Abbott, and their cohort were returning home to Genoa City not as the same people who had arrived at that sprawling chateau, but as individuals who had seen glimpses of themselves and one another under pressure, stripped of pretense. The physical storm may have passed, but the emotional aftermath had only begun to take root. Victor, always the master of suspicion and survival, had sensed something was off from the moment Kane invited them to his luxurious French estate under the guise of diplomacy and reconciliation. The delays, the ambiguous agenda, the sudden storm that forced them to stay longer than anticipated, it had all coalesced into a gnawing feeling that Kane Ashby had orchestrated far more than a casual gathering. There had been tension beneath every toast, subtext in every glance, and Nikki had not missed it either. As the jet lifted off the tarmac, carrying them back to Genoa City, the sense of unfinished business clung to the cabin air like static. Kane, of course, had stayed behind, at least temporarily. He had played his part masterfully, balancing warmth with mystery, openness with implication. His estate, surrounded by thick forest and old European charm, had served as the perfect backdrop for what might have been a social occasion but increasingly felt like a chessboard. Victor had pressed for updates on Chancellor Industries, tried to probe Kane's intentions, but the younger man had danced around every question with the grace of someone who knew his audience and knew how to manipulate it. Chancellor was on the verge of transformation, and Victor, despite decades of dominance in corporate warfare, felt the rare sting of uncertainty. It wasn't just Kane's potential ambition that worried him. It was the question of why now, why bring them all the way to France, isolate them, subtly antagonize Nikki, and sow small seeds of discord among the guests. There were too many variables and not enough answers. Nikki had been quietly unraveling her own thread of paranoia. At first, she believed the storm had merely trapped them in a bad coincidence. But as the hours turned into days, and the carefully curated charm of Kane's estate began to give way to undercurrents of manipulation, she remembered the chilling silence that sometimes followed revenge plots in the past. She thought about Lily Winters and the unresolved animosity from the Chancellor takeover, how she and Victor had maneuvered to strip Lily of power and legitimacy, believing it was for the greater good. And yet, what if Lily hadn't forgotten? What if Kane was acting on her behalf? Or worse, what if Kane had quietly decided that Chancellor was worth betraying everyone for, regardless of Lily's consent or disapproval? Nikki brought her suspicions to Victor, but he was already ahead of her. His gut had turned days ago. The Newman instincts were rarely wrong for long. It had been Sharon who, despite everything, brought a strange note of calm into the chaos. When Nikki confronted her about the possibility that Lily was quietly orchestrating something with Kane, Sharon had dismissed it outright. Lily, she said, had no interest in involving herself in any more betrayal. She had moved on. She had chosen healing, and though Kane might be wading back into the trenches of power plays and manipulation, Lily had left that battlefield. Sharon, as always, believed in redemption. But belief and reality were not always aligned in Genoa City, and Nikki wasn't prepared to write off any possibility, no matter how remote. Trust, after all, had long ago become a liability in their world. Meanwhile, back in Genoa City, whispers were beginning to stir, of an impending crisis, of something dark looming just beneath the surface of returning normalcy. Josh Morrow, ever cryptic in his comments to the press, had hinted at a murder mystery. He hadn't revealed where or when, only that it would happen, and that it would matter. The storm in France had kept the key players away, but now that they were returning, the question remained, would the tragedy follow them home, or had it already taken root there in their absence? Perhaps the murder wouldn't happen in France. Perhaps it would unfold in Genoa City, like a slow poison no one saw coming. Victor had many enemies, and even more frenemies. If Kane had been baiting them all along, was it merely a diversion from something far more sinister unfolding behind the scenes? Billy, for his part, had remained relatively quiet during their time abroad, but his silence had not been apathy. He had been watching, analyzing, picking up on the same cues Nikki and Victor had sensed, perhaps even more acutely. There was something Kane-like in Kane these days. A restlessness. A rage under control. And for someone like Billy, who had danced with the shadows of addiction and vengeance, the signs were unmistakable. He couldn't shake the feeling that Kane was planning something drastic, and perhaps even irreversible. The question was whether Chancellor Industries was the real prize, or just the cover for something darker. Kane had always been clever, but cleverness alone wasn't enough to outplay Victor Newman. Unless Kane had help. Unless the storm that trapped them had been a metaphor for something more, something orchestrated. What if one of the guests in France hadn't been just a pawn in Kane's game, but a co-conspirator? Nikki began to retrace every interaction, every offhand comment, every flash of tension between attendees. Trust was a rare commodity, and now she questioned whether even their close circle had been compromised. The storm had kept them physically confined, but emotionally it had unlocked doors that could no longer be closed. When they arrived back in Genoa City, the usual comfort of returning home felt unusually thin. The Newman Ranch, typically a fortress of legacy and power, felt colder. Victor's office, his sanctuary, was no longer a place of control, but of questions. Nikki spent the first night back unable to sleep, replaying fragments of conversations from the estate, wondering whether the real threat had followed them back or had simply never left Genoa City to begin with. If Kane had a plan B, what was it? And more importantly, who else had bought into that plan? Meanwhile, back in France, Kane stood alone in the estate's grand hall, gazing out at the still saturated grounds, his reflection mirrored in the tall window panes. He lit a cigar with the ease of a man who had just set 1,000 dominoes in motion. Chancellor was still in play, but his true objective had evolved. Power, yes, but also exposure. Kane wasn't just seeking revenge. He was seeking justice, his kind of justice. There were secrets locked in Victor's past, inconsistencies in Nikki's virtue, hypocrisies in Billy's reinvention, and above all, a pattern of silence that had protected the elite for too long. Kane had been underestimated for years, dismissed as a transitional player in a game dominated by giants. But he had learned. He had waited. And now, with the world watching the storm, he had begun to move. What no one in Genoa City yet knew was that a letter had been sent. A confession? A threat? Or simply a warning? Only time would tell. But as Victor prepared to meet with the board at Newman Enterprises, as Nikki reached out to Sharon once more in the hope of clarity, and as Billy stared down his own reflection wondering how many more secrets would be unearthed before this was all over, the machinery of the next chapter had already started grinding forward. Someone would die. Someone would fall. And whether it happened under the golden sun of Genoa City or in the candlelit corridors of a French estate, the storm had only just begun. Lily hadn't planned on seeing Kane that day. In fact, she had structured her entire weekend around avoiding him. But Genoa City had its own rhythm, a haunting predictability in its unpredictability, and somehow their paths always seemed to cross either in boardrooms, on the fringes of Newman family affairs, or within the shadows of Chancellor Winters. He approached her in the atrium with that familiar look, somewhere between regret and hope, like a man who hadn't yet accepted the weight of rejection. His words came easy, worn from use, as he gently invoked memories of what they had shared, the children they had raised, the moments that had once felt sacred between them. But to Lily, it was all just noise now. White noise. Background static echoing from a past she had long outgrown. It was the way he spoke, the earnestness in his tone, that seemed so rehearsed, so fundamentally unchanged. He said he was different. He said he had matured. He said they weren't the same people anymore, and maybe that meant they could start again. But that was the very heart of Lily's resolve, they weren't the same people anymore, and that meant they shouldn't. She reminded him, calmly but firmly, that their time had passed. That she wasn't a girl anymore, clinging to fantasies of loyalty and redemption. That she no longer believed love could conquer betrayal. Kane had been her first true devotion, but he had also been her first and deepest disillusionment. And no matter how many storms they had survived or how many smiles they had once exchanged, she had built a life without him, and she was not about to look back. But the moment that truly sealed it wasn't her words. It was her actions. It was the heat of the evening, the low hum of a jazz melody playing at a Chancellor Winter's rooftop event, and the sudden surge of impulse that pushed Lily to do something she hadn't intended, kiss Damian Kane. She didn't do it to hurt Kane. At least, not entirely. She did it because it felt right in that second. Because Damian was magnetic in a way that was fresh, unburdened by history. Because she wanted, for once, to choose desire over duty, the present over the past. And yes. Perhaps subconsciously, because she knew Kane would see. And he did. The way his face tensed, the way his knuckles clenched around his glass, told her everything. He had wanted clarity, closure, a maybe. What he got instead was confirmation. But what happened next was more subtle, more insidious. It wasn't Lily's rejection or the kiss itself that sparked the whispers across Genoa City. It was the retcon. The subtle rewriting of history happening not on paper, but in conversation. It began when Kane confronted Lily, feigning composure as he recounted their past and floated the idea that maybe, just maybe, they could find common ground. And Lily, sharp as ever, replied with the kind of line that would reverberate through YNR fans like a stone dropped in a still pond, "We're not kids anymore, Kane." A perfectly reasonable sentiment, if it weren't for the fact that they hadn't been kids when they met in the first place. In truth, when Lily and Kane first came together, she had barely stepped into adulthood, just 18, while he was a man well into his early 30s. At the time, the age gap had been controversial but woven into the drama, part of the texture of their romance. They had overcome it, fans had debated it, and the show had never denied it. But now, with Damian Kane, portrayed by the significantly younger Billy Flynn, being positioned as her new romantic interest, the dialogue seemed to be curiously erasing certain details. Reframing their past in a way that felt less like evolution and more like strategic amnesia. And viewers noticed. Soap fans have long memories, longer than the characters themselves, often, and the idea that Kane and Lily had been some pair of naive 20-somethings fumbling toward maturity didn't sit right with the historical record. It felt convenient. Like the writers were smoothing out a wrinkle in the fabric of canon, not for the sake of the story but for optics, or casting dynamics, or marketing. Some fans joked that perhaps when Kane lost his accent, he lost a decade too. Others whispered that the show had finally acknowledged what had always been whispered but never said aloud, that Lily had been too young, and Kane too seasoned, and their love story had always been built on unequal footing. But within the story, Lily wasn't concerned with the meta. She was living her truth. She had found her strength. She had walked through fire, family scandals, corporate takeovers, cancer, widowhood, betrayal, heartbreak, and emerged wiser, more self-assured. Damian, with his quiet intensity and respectful distance, wasn't just a rebound. He was a choice. A reclamation of agency. He didn't remind her of who she used to be. He invited her to discover who she might still become. Still, Kane wasn't done. Not with her. Not with the world. He began to linger in conversations, float ideas to Billy, murmur about unfinished business. There was something dangerous in him now, not the wild, impulsive danger of a man in love, but the cold, strategic edge of someone who had been humiliated publicly and wasn't sure whether to walk away or burn it all down. He started digging into Damian's past. Started asking around, subtly, about Damian's connections, motivations, secrets. He told himself it was for Lily's safety, but it was really about his own ego. He couldn't accept that she had truly moved on, not until he found a reason to discredit her new interest. Not until he could justify to himself that it had all been a mistake, that she would come back once she saw the truth. But Lily wasn't coming back. That kiss had said more than any declaration ever could. And the retconning, the shifting narrative, only reinforced her resolve. She wasn't going to let the past define her anymore, not even nostalgically. She wasn't going to sugarcoat a dynamic that, in hindsight, had been more unequal than romantic. She wasn't going to fall back into old roles because they were familiar. She was ready for something real. Something new. And perhaps, deep down, Kane knew it too. But knowing didn't make it easier. It only made the silence between them louder. And as Damien grew closer to Lily, as fans debated timelines and producers danced around uncomfortable truths, the world of the young and the restless did what it always did best: blur the lines between legacy and reinvention, between love and delusion, between history and the stories we tell ourselves to survive. If you'd like to continue this into a storyline where Kane retaliates, Damien's secrets unravel, or Lily is forced to confront a complicated pregnancy or public fallout, just let me know, and I'll expand the next chapter. Victor Newman had never believed in coincidences, and his gut told him the weekend in France had been more than just a storm-delayed inconvenience. There were too many threads converging at once: Kane's carefully timed invitation, the extended isolation, the elusive subtext in every conversation, and now, the ripple effects were beginning to reach Genoa City in ways he could no longer ignore. As the jet's wheels hit the tarmac and the skyline of his empire came into view, Victor found himself glancing toward Nikki, whose expression betrayed the very same doubt he had harbored silently during their return flight. Something was brewing, and it wasn't just the aftermath of a failed getaway. It was war, disguised in silk gloves and champagne smiles, and Kane Ashby was at the center of it. Back at Newman Tower, Victor quickly called a closed-door meeting with Nick, his trusted son, and began to recount Kane's so-called offer to buy Chancellor Industries. It was a strange move, Victor noted, especially coming from a man who claimed to want reconciliation. The offer hadn't been casual either. Kane had approached both Victor and Nick with a demeanor that was equal parts friendly and transactional, a tone too polished to be genuine. And though Victor had refused outright, shutting down any notion of selling Chancellor to Kane, the ease with which Kane accepted the rejection bothered him more than any negotiation tactic. Men like Kane didn't walk away that easily. If he wasn't rattled, it was only because he already had something else in motion. Victor's mind turned to Jack Abbott. Of all his rivals, Jack was the one who understood Victor best and hated him the most. Their shared history was a battlefield of hostile takeovers, stolen board seats, and public humiliation. The idea that Jack could team up with Kane, a known wildcard with a grudge and something to prove, was not far-fetched. But Nikki, always astute in ways Victor sometimes underestimated, offered a more refined perspective. It wasn't Jack he should be watching. It was Diane Jenkins. Nikki had seen the glances, the subtle power plays at the French estate. Diane hadn't said much during the stormy weekend, but her presence had been surgical. Observing. Calculating. She was no longer the reactive woman Genoa City once mocked. She was composed now, dangerously so. And if she had aligned herself with Kane behind closed doors, it would be a partnership born not out of sentiment, but strategy. Victor leaned into Nikki's analysis, as he often did when things reached the territory of intuition and manipulation. But just as they began to map out potential alliances and weak links, another name exploded into relevance: Phyllis Summers. Unlike Diane, Phyllis didn't operate in the shadows. Her schemes came wrapped in sarcasm and neon arrogance. And now she was going around town, telling anyone with a Newman last name that she was involved in something big with Kane. That together, they were working on a massive opportunity that would shake up the business landscape. That she had earned Kane's trust. That they were destined to co-rule a new empire, free from the fossilized grip of Victor and his ilk. Victor rolled his eyes at the absurdity of it, but Nikki warned him not to dismiss it outright. Phyllis may be reckless, but she was rarely without an angle. The story she was spinning might have been bloated with ego and exaggeration, but what if the core of it was true? What if Kane had indeed approached Phyllis as a pawn, or worse, a willing ally? The woman had a history of throwing herself into chaos just to claw her way to relevance. If she believed Kane could deliver power or revenge, or even just recognition, she would follow him without hesitation. But Victor wasn't ready to confront Phyllis yet. Not directly. He preferred letting the noise swirl around her until she revealed her hand on her own. Instead, he focused on Nick, instructing his son to discreetly monitor all communications between Phyllis, Jack, Diane, and Kane. Not just emails or messages, but financial movements, legal filings, contracts. Anything that indicated consolidation of influence. Because Victor no longer believed this was about Chancellor Industries alone. It was about reshaping the corporate hierarchy of Genoa City. It was about legacy warfare. And Kane had set the board in motion while Victor had been trapped under a European storm. The mistake would be assuming the game was still in its early stages. It wasn't. Victor had already made his first refusal, to sell Chancellor, and that meant Kane had already moved on to Plan B, whatever that was. And if Plan B involved forming alliances with Phyllis or rekindling toxic ties with Jack, then the threat was already within the city's walls. Nikki grew more concerned by the hour, watching as Victor obsessed over maps of corporate ownership and traced strings of influence like a general preparing for siege.